Talking to Jason Lauritsen. He's the author of Unlocking High Performance and Social Gravity. He serves as an advisor and management innovator to startups and enterprises. Today, he'll be talking about not only, how we fall off the tracks or the rails with performance management today, but what can we actually do to build better employee experiences that result in a strong relationship between employee and employer getting back on the track. Before we get started, I just want to welcome all the newcomers out there. We do usually have a lot of newcomers, not just people that are coming back to People Fundamentals. Please put in chat if you're a newcomer. I guarantee you're going to get a warm welcome from the audience. For those of you new to People Fundamentals, real quickly, just want to talk a little bit about why we do this in the first place. People Fundamentals are not a new concept, yet HR leaders are focusing more and more on it than ever before. And that's because work is going under so many fundamental changes right now. The pace of change is so fast, from the hybrid work environment to just generally the expectation of the employee, and now this profound technological change with generative AI and how we're going to just fundamentally interact with computer technology for the rest of our lives. You all know firsthand as employees personally that we all aspire to achieve challenging goals, be creative, think outside the box, even if the path isn't clear forward. We work our hardest to do great things at work. And that type of engagement signifies dedication to the outcomes the business is striving to achieve. But with all the changes around us, the playing field and the rules of how the game has changed are just constantly changing around all our employees. And as a result, People Fundamentals, the way we think about this, it's a business imperative to respect these People Fundamentals because they are one of the only stabilizing factors around all this change. They always ring true. They always matter to employees. And if they're neglected, you risk disengagement, burnout, and unfortunately, regrettable attrition as well. So Betterworks ultimately believes in supporting, let's see here. I got to click forward here. Sorry about that. Betterworks supports HR leaders in adopting an employee-centered approach that puts employee well-being at the forefront, ultimately leading to enhanced business performance. The way we think about People Fundamentals, ultimately our tag here is, put simply, what's good for people is ultimately good for business. This is our 9th installment of People Fundamentals. You just heard we have a 10th one coming with Stacia Gar from Red Thread on 6/27. I should say that in June 27th date for all international reasons. But basically with Stacia Gar, you are going to hear about how people analytics and insights can drive to better manager effectiveness. Anybody concerned with that topic, it's a must-have attendance. With People Fundamentals, all of these webinars are available, recorded on betterworks.com, free. You'll still get your HRCI credits. So I recommend going back to them if there's any topics that pique your interest. And the only thing we're asking for in return is chat, have conversations with us, ask questions. I will take as many questions as I possibly can and ask Jason during our session today. And please provide feedback at the end. We value it. We read every bit of it, and we keep trying to improve this as a platform for thought leadership. So the reason we ultimately do People Fundamentals from a Betterworks perspective, it's ultimately our mission and passion to help you as HR leaders put these principles into practice and realize the benefits of an engaged and productive workforce. Betterworks is modern performance management. We call it performance enablement. And we believe that it ultimately flips the script on traditional backwards-looking performance management processes that were compliance-driven from the start. And those processes, we know everybody hates them. Employees, managers, HR, and the leadership of the company. Performance enablement is forward-looking, development, and achievement-oriented. And ultimately, the proof is in the pudding. We did a blind study, global, last year, and what came back was that if people that use our platform have a 44% greater willingness to put in discretionary effort than those that do not. And that just basically says that you do have the technologies out there, you do have the processes, the thought leadership is there. There are people out there already solving this problem to drive up greater engagement. So with that, I did want to mention one announcement that we made ultimately at Empower HR a month ago. It's pretty exciting. We introduced our advanced analytics solution by our announcement partnering with Visier, a leader in the space. This is a game changer for HR professionals that have felt like they lack strategic insights to making more actionable decisions on how to best drive employee success. And there really hasn't been anything like this in the market before. This gives you superpowers with respect to your analysis and data visualizations to uncover previously unseen and unknown patterns between performance, engagement, behaviors, skill development, and so much more. I recommend checking it out. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Jason Lauritsen. Jason is a repeat offender, let's put it that way, with our People Fundamentals series. I think he's very well known in the HR tech space, so I don't think you need a big biographical introduction at this point. I do want to, so I think we should call out, like, let's get something personal here for an introduction. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Jason, and tell us something we don't know by looking at LinkedIn.
Well, John, thanks for having me. I always am delighted to be here with Betterworks with you guys. It's so fun, and I appreciate the work you do, and there's such alignment. So I am grateful to be here. Thank you for joining us today from I see everywhere all the way to Nigeria. It's an amazing group of people here with us today. I'll skip the bio. I've been studying employee engagement performance in organizations for 20 plus years. I speak, I teach. I specifically have a passion for teaching managers and leaders, helping people make sense of things. And the thing that I guess a little personal, the thing you won't get from my bio, although if you visit my website, you would know, my favorite job I have is being a husband and father. I have 3 amazing kids. That I spend more of my time, I think, shuttling them around and watching them do things and grow than I do anything else. And a fun fact that is usually surprising to people when they meet me is that I am 6'5". I am a tall guy. So most people, when they meet me in person, John, you can attest to this. They're like, "Whoa, I didn't realize you were so tall," because everybody's the same size on Zoom. So there's that. How's that?
That is true, actually. You were the tallest person at HR Tech that I ran into on the floor the entire time, there were a lot of people there, so I would say, for sure. Well, let's go ahead and let's dive into the conversation. Let's talk about your book in particular around unlocking high performance. So, you start out the book by the way, here's the book right here, physically right here. You start out by sharing your personal, and I just knocked things over. You start out by sharing your personal story out of college, where you were kind of wandered into sales as a place you could make some money. And you started at Minolta Copiers from the story there. And then ultimately you burned through a few other jobs. And I think you kind of summarized it as you were a little bit surprised at how much work can really suck and how much everybody kind of felt like that around you. And you ultimately, then you switched into recruiting, right? And as you changed into corporate recruiting, then you had the broader optics of seeing just, how dysfunctional work can ultimately be. And then, somehow you were lucky enough to find a position with a CEO that really understood how to modernize and to put people first. And it really was like an awakening for you. I hope I got that part of the introduction in your book correct. You as a thesis coming out of that awakening is everybody has to rethink performance management. So why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about what inspired you to get here, the book, and any takeaways that I think are important about rethinking performance management.
Well, how much time do we have, John? That seems like an hour question in and of itself, but I will do my best to put a fine point on this. This book actually was, you get asked if you've written books, which I've been through the process too, and it is a hard process. I'm shamelessly, self-promoting these 2 right behind me. But the unlocking high performance, they'll ask you a question like, how long does it take to write the book? How long did it take you to write that? And I'm like, for me, the honest answer with unlocking high performance is it took me 20 years, because unlocking high performance was basically it was sort of this point in time, like, here is what I have discovered, here's what I've learned after being in this work, studying the work, researching, trying to fix things for the last 20 years. And I brought that forward, and the sort of a labor of love, lifetime work, right? And the thing that is, I would say, sort of the underlying point of the book is that performance management, as we have historically thought of it, when we talk about performance management, we talk about it as like an event. It's a one time a year appraisal, or it is a series of interactions we have around things like setting goals or providing some feedback or something. But it's always very sort of, we think about it as like individualized kind of interactions, right? And what I came to understand in my sort of journey, I guess, through working for others, is that organizations exist for performance. Every organization, whether it's a for-profit, nonprofit, anything in between, has a what I'll call a performance imperative. If you don't exist to produce something, to offer some kind of service, have some kind of impact, to perform in some way, you don't need an organization. The organization wouldn't exist. So every organization has a performance imperative. Every organization then hires people for the sole purpose of meeting that performance imperative. You're hired to be there to help us achieve that. And so at the end of the day, everything is about performance. It has to be, because without it, we don't have jobs, we don't have organizations, we don't have any income to distribute. And so what I realized was, it was so short-sighted. Here's this performance imperative, which is why we exist and have jobs. And yet, when we talk about performance management, we're talking about such little pieces of this. And that the case I make in the book basically is that performance management is not an interaction or an event. It is a system. It is management, right? Because management is about facilitating that performance so that the organization can meet its objectives and meet this performance imperative. And so we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff that's in the book, but I think the takeaway is, at least my hope was that the takeaway of this book is that you need to fundamentally rethink how you understand performance management if you want to create an organization and an experience for people where they can be their best, they can do their best, and that they will willingly offer that to you. So that's the case I'm making in the book. And then I talk about how to do that.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and, we like to start with some interactive polling that can kind of like tee up the questions as well that we're going to discuss. So let's go to our first poll question here. So the question is, has the performance review process in your company undergone a fundamental shift since 2020? So we'll give everybody about a minute to answer the question.
I'm going to be so interested to see this one, John. What is your bet based on your experience? Let's take a wager on what we think will be the results here.
Wager.
We don't have to wager anything, but let's at least guess. Like, you tell me what you think it's going to be. We'll see who gets closest.
Yeah. I mean, 2020 is a pretty big milestone. I think Jen Lim calls it BCE, before COVID era. And I think companies did rush to try to make changes. So I expect change to be a pretty high thing on the list. Maybe not as satisfied with that change, but that's my guess. I don't know if I have a percent in my head.
I'm going to go, I'm guessing, my guess is B is the runaway.
Is the runaway? Okay.
Yep. That's my bet. I don't know. That's my bet. I'm hoping. And then maybe we'll move them to C by the end of this, end of this conversation. Who knows?
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. There we go. Oh, 23. So what is the answer?
I was wrong.
You were, well, you said runaway, right?
Too optimistic. That's all right.
Okay, well, your horse came in with a photo finish win, so it's still not a bad bet. So
no, well, and I'm surprised by how much that things have not changed, and I think that is that's really interesting. That half of you have not seen any major changes, and so I think hopefully we're gonna make a case for why that should shift in the next 40 minutes or so.
Absolutely. I do think that is surprising that much. I thought with 2020 on it, there's lots been going on, but Okay, well, let's go ahead then. So why don't we dive back into questions then? So based on that, why do most performance management programs ultimately fail? So it's not only whether somebody's done something or not, but usually people are not very satisfied with the results.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, to be very clear, when we say that they fail, I think what you and I are talking about is on two different levels. One is they there's pretty significant evidence that even when we change up or we try to improve our performance management programs with best efforts, they don't actually yield performance results in the way that we expect. And the second is managers still don't want to do it and employees still like hate the process in general. And so there's something really wrong. And I would say that the reason they fail is a couple. One is that in HR broadly, the trend over the last 20 years, in my experience, has been that when we innovate our processes in HR, we have had a tendency to start from, we take the existing process and then we add technology, we try to make it faster. And so we innovate it by speeding it up, making it more accessible, giving you tools. But like you still have a bad process, you just now have more tools to implement the bad process, or maybe it's a little bit faster and more painless to implement, but it's still not a great process. And so I think fundamentally the reason that it fails is that we don't go back and evaluate what is it that we are trying to accomplish, what ultimately are we trying to do, and to unpack that, I think the biggest thing we have to recognize is that, and this is why in the book, I spend 2 full chapters digging into the history of management, because like this question is a question I've been asking myself for a long time. And even heading into this book throughout my career, I was like, how did we end up here? Like, how did we get this so wrong that people are suffering in all these organizations and people hate this? Like, what is it? How did we get here? And when you look back at the history, here's what happened. At least this is what my interpretation of history is. If you look back, management is one of those things. The way we understand management, modern management, sort of managing other people at work, is actually a fairly modern invention. It didn't come into existence until probably, let's call it late 1800s, early 1900s, in kind of that period of industrialization. And the reason we needed management was because at that time we had these factories being stood up, and most of the work that needed to be done in these factories is work that was, it's better done by machines, but those machines didn't exist yet. We didn't have the technology for that. And so we needed people to very literally stand in for work that was better done by machines. And it was and it was terrible work. It's unnatural, unhuman kind of work, and the conditions weren't great. And so this is why Gary Hamel, the management guru and author, when he talks about management, he talks about management being one of the most important inventions of modern times, and that he describes that management was invented to get people to behave like semi-programmable robots. That's why management existed. And so that's management comes in to get people to do these bad jobs. And then because it was so bad, then we had the rise of labor unions. Labor unions came out, to rise up to sort of balance, try to improve that. And so labor unions work with ownership. They ultimately come up with contractual agreements for how to make work at least less terrible. And so out of this legacy of invention of management, we have basically 2 big things that happen. Number one, management sees and views employees as mechanisms of production, essentially as machinery. And number 2, they are conditioned to see and treat work like a contract. So those 2 things started very, very early. And then we've never replaced that paradigm. It worked fine at that time, I guess, as fine as it could, right? It was a bad situation, but then we got machines and we didn't need those. We have different jobs. Today, people use their intellect and their creativity and all of these things to produce work, and treating them like machines and work like a contract doesn't work anymore. And the problem is so many of our modern performance processes, talent processes too, are based on that same management model that we never displaced. And so you think about things like performance appraisals, performance improvement plans, job descriptions, policy manuals. All of these things were designed to administer this work as a contract to make sure that our human machinery is producing at the level we are paying them to produce. And so fundamentally, that's what drove it. And so our performance processes are designed to enforce that. It doesn't work for people. It doesn't work for modern managers either, because they don't like enforcing a thing on people that people hate. And then we just take technology and try to speed it up. That's why it continues to fail. We need a system reboot, start over, the totally different paradigm.
Yeah, and that system reboot, we're gonna transition a little bit to how do you prove the value of this change. And I think that when we talk about this issue that, and what you said early on, one of the ways we frame it is, if you ask pretty much anybody, does your performance management process and technology actually lift and raise performance in your company? Most people say no, which is, it's kind of shocking. There's not a lot of technology and process areas in a business where you get like that stark a no. So, I think one of those problems is the business case, a little bit of the like, how do I do this? How do I prove to management that we need to make this change? And to your point, it's not a small change. It's a big change, right? So let's go ahead and go to the next poll, and then I'm gonna ask you the question about sort of that question around how do we prove employee engagement is worth focusing on and quantify it.
Yeah, it is.
So question
and that is such a big. Yeah. Go for it. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, question number 2 is up. Have your attempts to improve your performance management process resulted in improvement in any of these areas? You have employee engagement, productivity, retention. If you feel like you have lifted the bar on at least 2 of them, then say more than 1 or none. If you haven't seen those results yet.
Well, after you've completed this poll, I would love to know, for those of you that said that your organization has made improvements or has changed up the performance process, what did you do? Like I'm just curious if you can give us in the chat, just drop in a kind of like, well, we changed this or changed that. I think probably, I don't know about you, John, but one of the things that strikes me is that if half of organizations haven't changed performance management processes since 2020, yeah, I wonder if that has something to do with why so many leaders want to pull people back into the office against their will, is because we haven't evolved our performance approach to work in this different environment.
That's actually a great observation. That's probably true, and I hadn't thought of that. I'm going to give a few shout outs, because while you were talking, Jason, I think it was a very cathartic moment for the audience. Chat kind of went wild. Katie said, it's all about the rear view mirror, not what's happening now and coming into the future. Tracy said, it feels like a report card instead of a conversation. Amanda said, it's so icky, for lack of a better word. So I think you just created a cathartic moment for many of the people on this session. I think they're with you.
So let's see the results. Why, right? It's good to know why. How did we get here, right? It's at least having that helps.
Yeah. Okay, so 47% or half the audience hasn't seen a benefit. And that really self-reinforces the challenge of proving to your management team that investment and change are worth it. And so I know your book, you go into the topic of employee engagement in rather great detail and the impact it can have, and even beyond that. So why don't you share some of your thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, I think, and I'll put the lens on that you just sort of teed up, which is, how do we get our organizations to pay attention to this, to sort of recognize, how do we convince our executives that investing in engagement and performance is worthwhile? And I think first, it starts with a conversation about definitions, like getting clear about what we're talking about. And I think for years, I have been shouting from the rooftops as much as I can about the fact that if we want our leaders to be serious about engagement, we have to be better about being clear about what we're talking about when we talk about engagement. So the way that I define engagement is that employee engagement is the degree to which an employee is willing and able to perform up to their potential. So let me unpack that for a second. And this is also, it's not only a definition, but it's why engagement matters. Because if you think about this, back to the performance imperative, right? Everything is about performance. Engagement is the work we do to unlock employee performance so that we can meet that performance imperative. And there's two pieces to that. An employee has to be willing and able to do that work, to perform up to whatever their capability is at that time, their potential at that time. And so I think one is realizing and talking about engagement in context of performance, because that's the reason it matters. Not that it doesn't matter. I mean, we tend to get wrapped up and we're going to talk about relationships. We're going to talk about a lot of things today. But we tend sometimes in HR to over-index when we're talking to executives on the people side of things, and we forget, and I say the people side, like hearts and minds and all of that, and that's incredibly important. It's incredibly true, but you have to remember that executives, they're the ones that live the performance imperative every day. Their heads roll when the performance imperative isn't satisfied. And so you have to talk about engagement in context of that. And so there's that piece of it. But then there's also like making it real, helping people understand. You talked about discretionary effort earlier. Discretionary effort is that's like the Gallup popularized that as the outcome or the reason we do employee engagement. Discretionary effort, I have a love-hate relationship with that word, because on the one hand, it sounds like free work, but I don't think that's what was intended. Like, you're going to get work that you didn't have to pay for. That's discretionary effort. I don't think that's the helpful version of it. The helpful version is when you create an experience, when you have a system at work and you support, you skill up your managers on how to do this, run this system to interact with people. What happens, there's the willingness and the ability is you make sure that people feel like they have everything they need. But they also, this willingness part is like, how do I feel about work? Do I feel committed? Do I feel like this matters? And when I have those two pieces in place, what happens is I stop looking at the clock. I stop thinking about, what might be next or what might be better. And work starts to feel very natural to me. And I fundamentally believe we all need to work. It's a very innate human natural thing that we have a need for. And when we're in a situation that our core needs are met, and we can do some of that work that feels good to us, then you get more of my creativity, you get more of my energy, you get more of my commitment, you get more of my focus, and that produces better performance outcomes. And so at the end of the day, that's what we're after. That is the conversation we need to be having with executives, is like, this isn't about survey scores or isn't about any of that. This is about creating an experience, an environment so that people will willingly and in a way that feels good to them perform at a higher level. Everybody wins. Everybody wins.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to take a comment that came in. We got a positive from Michelle S. We are goal setting consistently and in alignment with org strategy, and we have regular conversations to support performance. Our goal is to create the conditions for team members to bring their best work. I mean, that tells you a lot in summary of what you just talked about there in terms of, and I think that alignment, the goals, the connection back to the executives in terms of why this is done for performance's sake is very critical. So thanks, Michelle, for that comment.
Yep. It's awesome.
So let's go ahead and go. Let's go to that. I think you've hit a lot on this is a full change in philosophy and everything. And so, what changes should we make to shift the paradigm? Since it isn't just it's not a tweak on a process. It's something bigger than that.
Yep. Well, I think so let's go back to the history, sort of the underlying these underlying assumptions or underlying sort of principles we've inherited. And I want to start with the first one that we need to shift is this mindset that work is a contract and that performance management is a tool to enforce that contract. That is why it was originally designed. It's like, well, I pay the employee, right? We pay employees to do something. And so we need, and that's the contract, right? Time and output. And so we have to have this process that enforces, make sure we get our money's worth, sort of is making sure that we're getting from the machine what the machine should be producing. The problem is we have decades of data that tells us that the way employees experience work and what engages them to higher levels of performance, what gets them to want to stick around, are key drivers like things like feeling valued, feeling cared for, trust, appreciation, acceptance, right? Those are the things, if you've studied or worked with engagement for any time in the last several decades, you see these are the core drivers. And the thing is, those drivers, when you look at them, you step back and you look at just those things. If I put them on a list, if I put them up on a whiteboard behind me and said, what am I describing here? Feeling valued, trusted, cared for, appreciated, accepted. You're not going to say, oh, obviously you're talking about work, right? You're going to say, that sounds like a relationship. It's some kind of relationship you're talking about. And that was one of the an aha moment for me that cracked loose when I was doing the best places to work research, is that employees experience work as a relationship. And in order for them to be fully engaged and perform at their best, work has to feel like a healthy relationship. And so when we understand that as a core tenet, work is not a contract, it is a relationship for employees, then we have to think about how can we reshape our processes, our approaches, how our managers show up to foster relationship, teaching them how to do things like communicating for clarity, how to express sincere appreciation and recognition, how to create commitment and demonstrate support, how to authentically care for people. And we have to enable that, but we also have to design processes that help managers along, right? Use our technology, use our processes, use our performance management tools and systems to help managers foster that relationship. And so that's things like helping, building tools that remind managers to have more meaningful check-ins with their people and using templates to help them do that, for example. I see Allison saying, crucial conversations, exactly right. How to have the conversations that actually really matter with people is incredibly important. And so I think that's one of the places that it starts. I think that is thinking of and understanding work as a relationship is one of the shifts.
Yeah, and there was this great from the Q&A, and again, please put questions in Q&A and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Gina brought up a question I think gets into this. I'm going back to the executive and the one that's very data driven. You're shifting off of some traditional metrics in the contract. Then, when you have things like ongoing conversations, feedback, and coaching as your North Star, she's asking the question essentially, around continuous performance management. What tools or tactics can be leveraged? What tools and tactics can be leveraged, and how do we actually ultimately measure all of this too?
Sure. Well, let me. I think we can get into. I want to share a couple of things, I guess, that I think will be helpful here before I get into tactics. Let me share a couple concepts that I think will be helpful. And then we'll come back. Remind me to come back to that question, John, because I think we can tackle that one. But one of the other fundamental shifts that we have to make that's important to informing the tools and the tactics that we use is that I talked about earlier, that we started, management was created in this production era. And I grew up, one of the things that, as I got into this work and as I got older, one of the things that's important that I didn't mention, it is in parts of my bio, so I didn't use this, but I grew up on a farm in Iowa. So I'm an Iowa farm kid. And as I was trying to sort out and understand, like, what's what's wrong with work? What should we be doing differently? One of the things that struck me is growing up around farmers is that farmers are in the performance business. If you think about this, like that farmers are absolutely, their livelihood is dependent on fostering the growth and performance of other living things, right? They put these seeds in the ground, and if they don't grow to their potential, then the farmer could be out of a job or lose the farm or whatever. They are absolutely intertwined with the growth and performance of those plants. And I thought about like how farmers do their work. And farmers spend a whole bunch of time thinking about what can I do to support the growth of these plants. They do things like irrigation, right? Getting water out there. They fertilize the ground to make sure those plants have what they need to grow. They fight insects and they fight weeds, and they do all of these things. And in farming, they call this work cultivation, because they're cultivating the growth and performance of these plants. What was interesting to me is thinking about farmers is that farmers spend virtually no time worrying about whether or not that seed they put in the ground will grow. They don't spend a second worrying about it. They know that seed is genetically hardwired to grow into the best version of itself, so long as it has what it needs and it's free of obstacles. So they don't worry about it. They also don't try to motivate that seed to grow. They know that the growing is just the natural part. Their job, the work, is cultivation, making sure they have what they need and getting obstacles out of the way. And it struck me that's like, this is it. Like, this is the opposite of what we do at work, but this is the model that we need. And so I think when you see this, I'm going to push out a slide for folks. This is just a few slides I use in my training programs. If you think about the difference between, I call it the difference between a production mindset, which is the traditional approach of thinking of work or people as machinery to be optimized, and cultivation being sort of taking this farming type of approach or mindset to human performance. The interesting thing where it really shows up is when you think about how we talk about when people aren't performing. Because in a production mindset, what we do is we think, well, how can I fix this person? Because this is what we do with machinery. When machinery breaks down, what do? We fix it or we replace it. That's what you tell me that is not what our performance processes traditionally have been about. When an employee is underperforming, what do? We try to figure out what's wrong with them, make it clear that they better fix their business or then they're gone, right? We'll replace them with someone else. But the problem is, in cultivation, if we take the farmer's approach, and I would ask the audience right now, do you think that you've ever met someone in your life, ever, any human being ever, who wakes up in the morning and says, boy, I hope I fail today. I really hope I let down everybody that counts on me around me. Right, John, do you think you've ever met anybody like that?
I know are probably pretty few and far between. I think anybody who has teenagers might feel that way about their own kids, but
that's fair. That's fair. But that's a whole loaded another webinar, perhaps. We were talking about teenagers earlier. That's a different kind of intervention. But I would argue that even if you encounter someone who you think is doing that, it's usually because they've encountered some really terrible circumstances in their life, and they're stuck in a place that they don't feel like they have the opportunity to succeed, even if they chose it. And so what I would argue is that every single human being, given the means and the opportunity, will choose success over failure every single time. And if we can find our way to that belief, then treating our work in performance management like the farmer, bringing a cultivation mindset, means that when people are not performing, instead of saying, how do I fix you or replace you, we ask questions like, what do you need, right? What do you need that you don't have, or what's in your way? Because I know that if you had all your needs met and you didn't have any obstacles, you'd be performing. And so that is a huge shift. And that is what our processes should look like, is it should be shifting from, instead of assuming that an employee is broken and needs to be fixed, it's about assuming that that employee wants to. Why wouldn't they want to perform, right? It sucks to be an underperformer, right? Whether it's whether it's your actual performance or your behavior or whatever, nobody wants to be in trouble with the boss. It's miserable at work when you're underperforming. And so you want to fix it. And if you're not, it's because there's something missing. You might not know. And so the way you can go about this is, best tool I can give you for this is, John, is it okay if I just rant here for a minute and then I'll be done with my slides? But I'm going to give one more tool.
Yeah,
so
I think it's in line with a lot of the conversation, and a lot of questions are coming in as to get this out.
Awesome.
So yeah.
Awesome. So let me just roll through this next 2 slides and then we'll open it back up. So in order to cultivate, so you're probably saying, okay, great, I'm in. Cultivation mindset, sign me up, let's do it. How do we do that? Well, the most simple, straightforward tool I can offer you is a tool I teach to leaders and managers to help them understand why engagement actually matters. And so it's called the engagement equation. And this is not the kind of equation that they use to calculate engagement scores, so don't confuse it with this. This is a model. It's a teaching equation. And basically what I have found over the course of my career is that there are 3 variables that drive engagement. 3 variables. The first is well-being. And so that's sort of the degree to which I can offer my best to my role. So well-being, I like to think of as kind of like our internal battery that we have. It's sort of what kind of energy do we have to even offer to our work? When our well-being's diminished, we just don't have that much to give. So think about like when you try to work when you're sick, right? It takes 3 times as long to do work half as good. That's what well-being, when our well-being battery is different. So there's well-being. The second is satisfaction. Satisfaction is what we usually measure in our engagement surveys. And that's the degree, satisfaction is how my experience of work compares with my expectations. So if my expectations are here and my experience exceeds that, then I'm more likely to be engaged. If it doesn't, then I'm more likely to be disgruntled, dissatisfied, disengaged, whatever. So that's satisfaction. The third is drive. And drive is all about, am I motivated to do the things that need to be done, that matter? And so all 3 of these variables multiply to produce engagement. And as I mentioned earlier, engagement is about performance. And so here's the thing. For those that aren't math people, this equation has 3 variables. It's a multiplication equation. That's very intentional, because in a multiplication equation, what happens when any of the variables go towards 0? Rhetorical question. The product goes towards 0. So this is what makes this equation so important, is that if you ignore any one of these variables, you can get the other 2 perfect, and that variable can cancel out all of your work. If well-being's diminished and you do everything else right, you're still going to have decreased engagement and performance. If you do well-being right, but not satisfaction or not drive, then engagement and performance is diminished. And so you need to understand these 3 variables. Well, if we're cultivating, what we do is we take these 3 variables, and when we're thinking about performance, enabling performance, diagnosing performance, we need to be thinking about what needs need to be met or unmet. And so, for example, needs in well-being might be for support or flexibility. If I'm struggling with caregiving responsibilities, I might need support. Or an obstacle could be, I don't even know that I am unwell, right? And so maybe there's something there that we help them get to some kind of intervention that helps them get a sense of where they're at. Satisfaction is, I might be feeling underappreciated, and I can guarantee you about half your employees are feeling underappreciated right now, or not communicated with in an appropriate level, right? That could be a satisfaction need that they have. Then there's unmanaged expectations. And then finally, drive. And this is where we get to really some specific things in terms of what we think about traditionally as performance enablement. And it goes to the question you asked, John. When we think about needs, we sometimes think about the needs on the well-being side, like I need you to give me flexibility or support, or I need room for self-care or whatever. But we also, a need under the drive is, I need to be crystal clear about what's expected of me. Because when I know what's expected of me, I am infinitely more likely to do it if I understand it, or I need feedback. I need to understand how I'm performing against what's expected. Otherwise, how am I supposed to know when I need to dial it up or dial it back or change course? So that's an example of needs. And then finally is, a gap might be, I don't know how to do the things you're asking me or whatever. So this is how it plays out. So this is what a different approach to performance looks like when we start to really think differently about cultivation versus production. We start treating people like human beings and assume that they would be succeeding if they had the means and opportunities. This is how it looks.
Great.
John, I'll stop for a minute. I'm sure there's some questions.
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. I'm looking back again at, so let's go back to that one question from Gina really quick. So promised I would circle back to you, Gina.
Yep.
She was concerned about the measuring part because of the shift. Yep. Some of these, if you will, some of these feel a little more intangible. I think it would be, she didn't say that, but I think yep. that's part of it too, right? For a management brain who's trying to measure performance.
Yep. Yeah, and so here's what I would offer up in terms of the measurement is that the key thing to remember is that the first step of measurement is definition. And so one of the things that's always been broke about performance management is that the processes around clarity often were not strong. I mean, we might have some goal setting processes, but we do goal setting kind of in a moment in time, and it might not always seem super relevant, and the employee doesn't get to participate in that process to bring greater clarity to it. And so what I would offer is that if you want to create greater clarity in a more, let's say it's a more frequent touch point, it's ongoing continuous feedback and all of that, then there's also an imperative to really be on top of creating greater clarity around priorities, around goals, around what is expected. And if you have great tools, technology tools to help you with this, so you're recording these. So maybe you're calibrating, let's say, expectations, maybe performance outcomes and behavioral expectations, top 3, let's say, once a quarter. And you're doing that with the employees, and then you're having these continuous check-ins throughout. You can be reporting and creating almost like an ongoing tracking mechanism about where performance is and how it's trending and how it's tracking. And the interesting thing that I think, like, executives make the mistake of thinking like, well, once a year I have this annual performance review process and I can look at ratings and I can do this. But the problem is garbage data. So you have one data point based on garbage input versus having 50 or 52 data points weekly that are more specified and more dialed in and more connected to actual performance that you can go look at any given time for any given team. And then the executives can look at it at a high level. Are we meeting our performance imperative? If we're not, then we can very quickly get into an enormous amount of data and detail about where things might be breaking down. And so I don't know, I think that answers the question, but I would start with definition, clarity of what is expected at the employee level. That's where it all starts.
And to what you said about this continuous conversation, and particularly talking around goals, we like to talk a lot about meaningful conversations and putting structure around them. But Gina also, like, just to give an example, the average Betterworks user, an employee, logs in and uses the system weekly. And if you think about it, you compare that to the traditional process of quarterly, half annually, or sometimes people really only go in once a year just to update. The amount of data that, like, Jason's talking about there, imagine 52 weeks of data versus 1, 2, or 3, maybe 4 data points at the most. I think we only have time for one more question here. And I think I want to go back up to Kristen, who asked us quite a while ago, but I think it's an interesting one just to kind of wrap our minds around. And it's about the adaptability of the model. So, I think she asks, at times objectives are not achievable and not all dynamics are related to performance. And so, I guess in a sense, not penalizing individuals because some stuff just doesn't get done or whatever. I mean, I think you hit it in there, but maybe just kind of comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would caution against is that, and believe me, like I think I have thought about rebranding myself as the workplace hippie, because I'm kind of the peace and love guy usually, and talking about relationships and, teaching managers how to have relationships or whatever. So it's easy for me to kind of forget this other side. But the thing I would caution about in that question is everything is about performance.
Yeah. Everything
is about performance. At the end of the day, it all is about performance. If it's not, then I'm questioning why are we talking about it? Because I would say I think you would find your way back to it being about performance. But you're right. Sometimes it's harder to quantify things. So I want to offer this tool, because this is a takeaway people can use, really practical. To your point about meetings, John, and I think this connects back to this question, is it when I talk about performance exists on multiple levels. Performance is not just the output, but it's also the impact I'm having on team members. It is the way that I'm showing up. It's the behavior that I exhibit in my role. And so performance exists on a lot of levels. So one of the most powerful tools that we have as managers, and that we can equip managers with, is a meaningful, regular one-on-one conversation with a really intentional agenda. And so the one-on-one agenda that I teach is in front of you. And I wanted to give this to you because if you do nothing else, take this back and give this to your managers, teach them how to use it, build a template. 5 questions. And this first question is the one that, for me, was the one that was a game changer as a manager earlier in my career, because I learned to add this, because I'd have one-on-ones. We'd get to the end of a one-on-one and somebody'd say, oh yeah, by the way, I needed to let you know that, like, my wife got a cancer diagnosis last week, and so that might interfere. And you're like, whoa, like, what? You buried the headline. Like, we needed to be talking about that. Or I got a call from a recruiter and I'm not sure how to respond. And you're like, whoa, wait a minute. Why did we talk about all this other nonsense? Like, that's number one. So I put that at the top. What's the most important thing we need to discuss today? Because a one-on-one is a check-in with several check-in questions. And a great, meaningful check-in is all about asking a great question that opens up a meaningful conversation. And so these questions, starting here, and then if you'll see here, 2 and 3 are calibration. So the way you use this ideally is you put it in a tool like a Betterworks, and you and the employee both complete these questions in advance of your one-on-one. And then you come together and you compare answers, right? And you go back and forth talking about this. And what this does is it teaches managers, about, are they clear? It teaches managers about feedback. It teaches managers and employees about where there's breakdowns in communication. Because if an employee shows up and they answer, what have you accomplished since last we met? And it was nothing to do with what I thought they were working on or what I hoped they were working on, then we got to have a conversation, right? We got to get some clarity created. And so I just offer that up as a way to start. This helps managers see where they're at, calibrate, and focus in on what matters the most for them. So anyway, John, I just thought I'd throw that on the table before we had to wrap up.
Absolutely, and I lied. We're going to squeeze in a really quick, almost short answer here because it's so related. Tanya asked the question. She works for a large healthcare organization, and she had in her company, people have a lot of direct reports, and she says that one-on-ones are literally not even feasible at a weekly basis. Sure. With that, like, have you had to advise around like what to do when maybe the structure doesn't work in your favor for that?
So what I would recommend is, at a minimum, you have to figure out what one-on-one cycle works, right? And there's sometimes practical realities. So maybe it's a deeper, more formal one-on-one once a month with everybody. You got to be able to make time at least once a month in order. Otherwise, I would say that has to be made to happen. What I would recommend in between is, if you can't do formal one-on-ones, is teaching your managers to do more effective, shorter, high-impact check-ins. And I'm going to drop a video link. I have a video on YouTube that's sort of how to do effective check-ins. And in the comments below, there's a download to get some effective check-in questions. But that's how you do it. Is you need to have a formal one, I would say at least once a month. It's at least a half hour or so. But then what I would do is teach them to have more meaningful, like 5-minute check-ins with people that can cut right to the things that matter more quickly to stay on top of what's going on with people.
Great. Well, the questions were just constantly flowing in. I was sort of trying to do my best there to get to many of them. I think there's so many. We're going to promise on the Betterworks side, we're going to get out a blog to all of you. We're going to take the questions and we're going to answer each and every one of them because they're just so good. So I just don't want anybody to feel like, oh, I had my question out there and it never got covered. But we will do that. So thank you, Jason. We're going to go through a little wrap up here with a few notes. First of all, I just want to say, please register for the next webinar. Again, it's about people analytics. Stacia Gar from Red Thread is a tremendous speaker, thought leader in the space, and it's all about helping managers be more effective. So it's going to be a tremendous conversation. Another thing we didn't get to at the beginning, we are launching. We have a book from Doug Dennerlein and Jamie Aiken, my CEO and our HR transformation leader. And it's called Make Work Better. It's coming out on the 27th. So please look for that as well. We had a webinar on it recently. So the March webinar, if you want to hear more about the book, that's a great place to stop as well. So I think with that, it's a wrap. And I just want to thank you again, Jason. Thank you to the audience. Thanks for all the questions. We're going to get those answered. I hope you enjoyed the session.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.